Okay, so hi everybody. This is Adil Qayyum here, and I'm the moderator for today's session. That is strategy for game testing, QA masterclass. So this is a session that is prepared for GEC 2020, that is Games Emerge Conference, and so this is going to be about game testing, game strategy development. Everything that QA has to do in the gaming world. So before we dive into that, a little bit of my own introduction. I am working in the field of QA for about a decade now, and in this time I have worked across the board on lots of different applications. I've worked on web applications, mobile applications, including general applications or games, and apart from that, different big data projects. And in this time, across all these things, I've worked not only on manual side but on automation and leading teams and designing the different strategies. So across the board, across the board, lots of stuff that I've dealt with. So I've prepared, I've consolidated, the area for game testing, and I've prepared a presentation here for you guys. I hope you would like it. So generally, setting a bit of stage for the presentation itself. This presentation will be, revolving around what a QA has to do in the development cycle of a game, and what's the scope, what your responsibilities does QA have in that, and how to break it down. So for anybody who is a new QA engineer or who is working in this domain for some time, this is equally helpful for both of you. So if you've been testing games for a while, or you've been testing general application, you want to move into gaming testing, so it's helpful for you too. And for anybody who is like a fresher in this domain, it's equally helpful for you. So I'll try to break it down into most granular details so that you get the most out of it. So that's about the foundation of this talk, and let's dive into the session then. Uh, so starting from the agenda of the talk itself, I'll be talking about QA in general. So there are a lot of things, a lot of misconceptions, confusion around QA and the terminology, and what does quality assurance generally encompass? What does it have? Then we're going to be talking about game components. So as we're talking about particularly game testing. So after we decide what QA is, and we come to general understanding of that, we'll be seeing that, okay, if there is a game, regardless of whatever platform it's supposed, if it's the mobile game or it's a general console game, what components anybody, or particularly a QA person, needs to keep in mind in order to design a good strategy. So that's one thing. And then we'll be talking about types of game testing. So generally, when you're in the zone now, you have the product, you have the game, you have listed down all the components. Now you can see, okay, which testing types do I have, and what are the areas that it's going to be mapping to. So we'll be talking about types of game testings, and then we'll be talking about the process of game testing. Okay, so it's step-by-step procedure. First, you get to know the game in and out. You get to know what types are there for the testing, and then you understand the process. Okay, now I have the tools and technologies, I have the elements that I need to play around with. So how do I plug it in? What's the hierarchy, what's the orchestration that I plan my process so that it's going to be a successful cycle? So that's what we're going to be talking about. And in addition to that, nearing to the end of the talk, I'll be talking about some general tips and tricks. So once you've mastered it all, as a QA person, you've designed your strategy, you've designed your process, you've gone through the cycles of the game testing and all, so you've been working in for some time. Generally, there are some general tips and tricks that you have to have in your top of the list. So that's your checklist you need to ensure in order to have a good testing cycle. So that's what we'll be covering too. And at the end of the day, eventually, we'll be talking about the conclusion of the talk. So I'm hoping that at the end of the talk, for anybody, even who's a fresher, who's a mid-level professional or a senior professional, you'll be in a position to have a strong grip on the QA side of the game testing. And generally, you can extract a lot of information out of this. The process remains the same. If it's a game, if it's an application, the baseline process remains the same. So you'll be learning a lot out of it. So let's move a little forward with the agenda now. Okay. So first of all, what is QA in general? So the eye of QA, the headline of this slide basically is a QA has to be very keen, very detail oriented. So you have to be the scope that figures out what's wrong with the product. So first of all, I'm going to clear out some misconceptions. There people at certain times get confused between QA and QC. So most of the things that we covered up in the agenda and the general talk, we're talking about testing. So testing is a very broad term. We generally, when we talk about it, we just see that maybe we're just poking around with the application, and we are just doing the defect analysis and just finding the defects and logging them. So that's the testing part that we assume. Basically, there are two sides to it: QA and QC. So we're going to talk about it. Quality assurance is the prevention mechanism. As you see, the yin and the yang, both are equally important in the QA realm. Quality assurance is the prevention. So you preemptively decide how to avoid failures, how to avoid bugs. So that's the process that QA encompasses. So that's one thing. And second is the quality control, so detection of those issues, detection of those anomalies. So that's you have to have that figured out at the very first. You should be very clear what QA is, what QC is. And throughout this talk, and eventually when you do your work in your professional life, you'll be dealing with both of these. So there's going to be different weightage. Sometimes the QC part will be more, sometimes the QA part will be more. And as you progress through your profession, the QA part is going to be more and more important. So you start from the QC part because somebody else in the top layer is handling the QA part. So eventually you get to know those details and you figure out those strategies. So once we have that on parked on the side, so basically I have just general 4 pointers. Devising the processes as per requirement. So what does that mean? So you have a product, you have a game, you have some certain requirement listed out. Let's say we talk about Super Mario, or we talk about Dave. Those are very, very old games, and very basic. So there's a character, it has to jump, it has to knock a brick, it has to get the bonus, and it has to make it to once it reaches to the end, it has some certain score that accumulates to it. So you have to understand the mechanics of how the game works, so you know what the requirements are. So based upon those requirements, you'll be designing some processes. Setting up the KPIs and metrics is the mere quality. Okay, so once you know the requirements, you have your processes aligned that okay, this is the game, these are the areas, and this is how I'm going to address them. You define some certain quality KPIs. You see, okay, you say this is the ratio of lag that is affordable. This is the ratio of your character's reach in a certain area. So you define some certain metrics and KPIs to make sure that your quality measures are checked. So there is a lot of other other KPIs that are under the scope, but it differs from game to game or application to application. So thirdly, when we talk about executing your plan activities, so you have your process line, you have your metrics and KPIs set. Now you execute your planned activities. So first two parts for the QA, second two parts for the QC. So the entirety of it, as a game tester or as a game QA, you have to encompass that. So lastly, owning the product. So throughout in my career, I highly emphasize on owning the product. Don't just be a labeled person in the team. Don't just be a QA, don't just be a QC, don't just be the dev guy. Understand the product in and out, own the product, see the product from the user's perspective. So you're going to be in that hat, you'll learn a lot more. You'll be delving inside out, and you'll be figuring out a lot more areas that can be addressed. So you take that thing from to a whole another level. So that's one thing. So this is a very cool picture. I recently, few months ago, I saw this, and this is basically just to highlight the importance of the QA person or the QC person in the gaming development cycle. So this is about a game, Cyberpunk 2077. So this is a highly anticipated game in 2020, and it has, it's an open world game. It had a lot of action and RPG stuff. So this game was anticipated to be released a little earlier, but the team, you can see the head of the studio and the team itself, they launched this notice that Cyberpunk 2020 won't make it to the April release and would be delayed to September 2020. Why? Playtesting. So they say that they have completed the game, it's done, but they want, because there are a lot of stories, there's a lot of content, so they want to make sure that when the game comes out, it's fun to play. So they're bargaining some time for their QA team to make sure the thing is good. So this is how important the role of QA is in game testing, particularly because these are big industries. So if a good game goes out, you can take an example of GTA, you can take example of Angry Birds and any other hyper casual games on mobile. So lots and lots of revenues depends upon how immersive the game is. So this is how important it is. So next, first of all, before diving into what processes you need for testing, what testing types do you need, understand the game in and out. So I know there's a lot of text on the presentation slide at the moment, but I've just put it here because it's of grave importance. So you can later refer to this, and you can see whatever components were applicable to your project, to your game. So that's why I accumulated the most and I put it here. So I'm gonna go one by one very quickly to make you understand that what does each component mean. So starting from the first, the menu and the menu functions. Okay, so you enter the game, you start the game. First thing you look at the menu. It has to be seamless. It has to be very user friendly, and it has to be very descriptive. So this is the first component. Second is the art. So art, it encapsulates your sprites. Okay, so whatever your game sprites are, your character models, your texture, your terrain, the crowd, everything. The polygon game art is supposed to be very interactive and very blending in with the game. You make sure your textures and your character has the same level of detail. Your textures of one thing cannot be out from another. So talking about animations. Okay, so when your game is animation is the most core component of a game. If it's lagging at certain points and smooth at the others, if it's jittery, it kills the experience. So there's a lot of components to it. It's the realism, it's the frame rate, so you can read through those details. Fourthly, sound and sound effects. So any game that we have, so if you're talking about Angry Birds or whatsoever, when the you launch the bird in the air and it hits the bricks and it falls down, every detail has a sound to it, a sound effect to it. It has to be good enough to make an impact. It has to be right on time. So those things. So then the music of the game. And personally, being a gamer, I've been playing games for a long time. I can tell you music plays major role in the immersiveness of a game. So you have to be sure music plays the right time, and it gets you in the feel of the game at that moment. You cannot have a very rock and roll music playing on an RDS game, or you cannot have very slow music playing in a racing game. So it makes a lot of impact to the dynamics and the psychology of a game. Then we talk about the camera. So camera and cinematic views, your zoom in, zoom out, your general display of the camera, it has to make sense. The game flows and logic, it has to make sense. And the world level scenes. So these are some details, so that is specific to the game itself. So these, you have to check these things, that the world is completely done, it's not breaking at certain points, the levels are eventual. So those kind of things. So player attributes and action attributes. So generally, we're talking about RPG games, and generally these days PUBG or COD or these kind of games are very important. So very famous these days. So there are attributes to a player. So you have a score, you have your general skill set of your character that is eventually being developed over time. So you have to make sure that that is as per the rules defined. Then you have the condition to advance to the next level. Basic rules of the game, they should be working fine. Then you have the use of environmental objects. So if you consider an RPG game, you have to ensure that every object that has to be interactable is interactable. All right. So those are some of the things. Then it's the scoring and the progressive level of difficulty. So you make sure that if you're moving from level 1 to level 2, all of a sudden it's not a hell difficulty level. All right. It has to eventually progress from 1 to 2 to 3 to whatever levels there are. So there should have been a consistency in that. So there are some more components, and I know that when you look at this, you say, okay, so many gaming components, it's a lot boring and stuff. But I assure you that this is the foundation your game testing is standing on. Okay, the more components you have in your mind, the more components that you know about any game, you can just map it on whatever game you're working on. So maybe not all of these components will be on your applicable on your game, but maybe like 5 out of it, 6 out of it, 10 out of it, and there might be more. that are not mentioned here, but I just wanted to mention most of them here so that this would be a reference point for you to set it off. So just starting from the start again, the AL logic. So these days, whichever game we are playing, mostly each game has an AI logic built into that. So that's how the computer responds. That's how the NPCs respond to your game. So NPCs are basically the non-playable characters or just the environment. So everything has a response to your moves. So that should be seamless. So then there are statistics. The statistics are, there's high score, there's your attributes also come into the statistics, your progression of the character or anything. So that needs to be kept in mind. The title screens, the NIS, the SFX. So this is, the non-interactive sequences and the cinematics. So if you're moving through a level, and all of a sudden an action triggers a scene in the game that maybe has a storyline to it, so that should be seamless. That should have a good impact. So you have to test each and every part of it. So then the movie clip, it comes into that. The gamepad itself. So when we talk about the gamepad, we're talking about, there's some points, the use of multi-button action. So button mashing, or the ease of use of the button functions. So one thing is how the game looks. One thing is how the game feels and how it flows. The other thing is how interactive is that with the user. So if I need a button mashing a certain point, it should be doable enough to make the level cross. So it shouldn't be very difficult. It shouldn't be very hard to go through, and it should be user friendly and the device friendly part. So a lot of factors to it. Then we talk about the shock and vibration effect. So haptic feedback, I mean, these days, very important for the user to be immersed in the game. You need to have a haptic feedback. So lately, I just saw that PS5 is being released somewhere later down the lane. They release their controller, and they have better haptic feedback than ever. So because that's an important part of the gaming experience, you should be carrying that. Then at the end of the day, that's the boring stuff, but important, that there's legal text, there's some game options, and the tutorials part. So I hope that most of it sets the foundation for what you're going to do next. So moving forward, now we're going to be talking about the game testing types. So we understand what QA is, general job description and general role. We understand, okay, now a QA is planted into a gaming process. What could a game have? The bigger picture. We have everything laid out now, and we know that what components we need to test. So now, what kind of testing will be involved in all those components? So let's talk about the gaming testing types. So first of all, combinatorial testing. Okay, so combinatorial testing is, for instance, there are certain parameters, at the back end, which have certain combinations. So let's say a character can go forward and backward, left and right. And when it goes forward, it can hit, and it can go backward and hit, and left to right and hit. So these are some combinational moves. So, you have to lay out all the possible combinations there can be, and then perform each and every one of those. So you can probably automate that or something, but that's what the combinatorial testing means. Make sure every combination is working. Number two, functionality testing. So when we talk about functionality testing, it means that the key functionality. So for example, just forget about what the performance is, just forget about what the layout or whatsoever is. The function, the core feature of the game should be working. If my character is supposed to jump and stand on a brick, it should be doing that. If my character is supposed to roll on the ground and then stand up back again, it should be doing that. So functionality of the game is not breaking. That's what you test here. Then we talk about compatibility testing. So compatibility testing is, how compatible is your game on different platforms or in different specs. So you have to make sure, if you're making a game for Android, for let's say for 4.0 to 10.0, that's your compatibility range. You have to test for each and every version of it. And then it comes if on different resolutions, it comes for different hardware compatibility. So you have to make sure that your game is working fine for all of the described and requirements that you have already. So then we talk about regression testing. So regression testing is, as the word says, regressively, your game is developed. For instance, let's say first 4 levels, and then you add something in the first level, or maybe you add a 5th level. Then you test all these levels once again for all the possible areas to make sure nothing is breaking. So, this is what happens. People companies develop games and they launch the game, and then eventually maybe when they add some expansion packs to it, or maybe when they add some more updates to the game, something else breaks. Okay, so something that was previously working fine breaks now. So to make sure that's fine, you perform the regression testing. Ad hoc testing, as the word says, ad hoc, it doesn't have to be defined, it doesn't have to be following any process. It's just general testing. You start at any level, you start with any settings, and you make sure that things are working fine. So that's ad hoc. Then we talk about load testing. So as the word says, load testing, you have to put load on your game to a certain degree that is defined, and then beyond. Okay, so by load, what I mean is, you for instance, check your game for weaker specs, or maybe you create too many characters in the game, or you do too many actions at a certain time to make sure that the game is not crashing in any of these events. So that's load testing. You overload your game to a point and make sure, okay, certainly, the game's gonna crash at some certain point, but when it does a graceful exit. Okay, nobody likes a game when they're overloading a game and all of a sudden it crashes. You lose your save games, you lose your progress, it gets you out of the game, and that kills your user base. So even if at certain points the game is not meeting the load capacity, have a graceful exit, maybe prompt that the game is under immense load. You save the game and you exit, and then you reload whatsoever. So that's how you make sure that things are fine. Then we talk about playtesting. When we talk about playtesting, I can refer back to what Cyberpunk notice was their playtesting. So game is set. Okay, everything is defined, everything is working fine. You have done your functional and combinatorial and compatibility whatsoever. Now you put from a user perspective to make sure that fine, and the game has that immersive experience. So in this area, apart from everything functional, you make sure game is fun to play. Game is immersive, game is fun to play, and that's the selling point. That's the whole pitch of the game. So you make sure that part. And then there's soak testing. So soak testing is a very, very core area in games. Games have a different behavior from every other application. You know how? Because games can be paused. So you pause a game, you go, you eat your food, you do your homework, you do whatever you want, and then you come back maybe half an hour later. You want to resume the game from that same point and work seamlessly. So soak testing, refers to that kind of testing where you leave your game in a paused state or a stopped state, or maybe leave it running for several hours or whatever the capacity to make sure it's not breaking. So that's soak testing. You're soaking it with immense times. So that's one thing. And then at the end of the day, most commonly referred testing types in games, alpha testing and beta testing. I'm not going to be going into much detail about it, but generally alpha testing is your game is production ready. Before you roll out, you make sure it's working. That's the alpha test. You run it for maybe whatever the time defined, and you make sure everything is working fine. And the beta testing is, the game is now rolled out, not to the majority, not to the end users, but selected chunk of users, real-time users who are going to play your game and who are going to tell you, okay, from my experience as a gamer, this doesn't seem fine, or this is not working fine. So that's beta testing. So those were some testing types. Now we're going to be talking about the process of game testing. So having everything laid out, now you have, I'm going to be, flashbacking so that you have everything laid out now. You have the components, you have the testing types, you have the QA understanding. How do you plug it all together? All right, this is where your mastermind comes in. This is where your QA part comes in, okay? That I have 3 components out of 5. I would be requiring these 4 testing types out of 10. When do I do it, how I do it, and how do I report all the things that I've done? So testing process, it defines basically into 3 different components: the planning, design, execution, and report. So I'm assuming that before planning, the requirement gathering part is done. So that is also part of the process, but it's not mentioned here, but I'm just iterating you that requirement analysis and everything should have been done before you start planning. So when you dive into the planning, you do your test plans, your test strategy, your quality plans, and your sprint plans. So this part involves around, you figure out what components does your game have, you figure out what your requirements are, you lay everything down, you make sure what testing types are required, which system is compatible, what are your specs, what are all the possible flows your game's going to have, everything that you need to plan before diving into the actual activity. That's done here. So each and every component has a different definition. I'm not going to go into much detail around that because a lot of stuff. So that's planning phase. Then the design phase, based upon whatever you've planned, you design your test cases. So now you write it down. Now you document it. Now you say, okay, I have this 50 possible combinations. I have this 30 possible scenarios, or I have this, for each testing type, I have these checklists. If I'm going to be talking about functional testing, I have to make sure the character is running, it's walking, it's shooting, it's sitting down or crouching or whatsoever. So I have to make sure that's working. Then your test data. Okay. So for every test, you got to have some input, you got to have some expected output. So that's your test data. That's what you prepare in the design phase. And then your test environment. So very important, before you starting your testing, you got to have your devices ready. Okay. So you got to have your specific OS installed, and you got to have your hardware specs, whatever you're going to test on. Everything should be logged and loaded before you start testing. So that's the design part. Once you're designed, once you're done the planning, then the execution and the reporting. So you run your tests, iterate over all your test cases and whatsoever. For each test case, you mark your statuses, pass and fail. In case of failures, you have your bugs logged and have your reports. So this is the part that is the most important in terms of, your report should be concise. If you run 100 test cases on your game, your report should be, if I see the report from the first look, I get, okay, so 80 are paused, 20 tests are failed. What's failed in these 20 test cases? It refers to that bug. Okay, what was the priority of that bug? What highest priority or low priority? What was the severity of that bug? When do I fix it? If it's fixed, what's the repercussion? So everything should have a certain layout let down in a report. So that part is very important. So that's where you do your reports and final closure of the test. So that's the flow of your game testing. That's how you go. You plan the game testing parts, you design whatever your requirements are, you go to the execution and reporting parts. And at times when working in the team, there are different requirements to reporting. At times it can be very BI tool oriented. At times it can be very thorough, it can be very lousy text and everything. So make sure your report is interactive, so that the end user, even your team members, even your managers, or the product owners, the stakeholders of the game, when they see the report, they have a clear picture of what you've done so far, what state is the game in. Okay, so this is the deciding factor when you should go to production or not. So that's the entire QA process, and I hope you have the grip on that. Let's move forward. Okay, so now I assume that you know whatever needs to be known in the realm of game testing. Okay, so we're nearing the end. I'm going to be talking about some high-level things. So at this point, you know what a QA is, you know what the role responsibility is, you know what components a game would have, what testing types you would have. How do you knit it all together? Okay, you have the entirety of that idea. Now you just need to know, what tips and tricks you'll be having at the top of the mind before starting your game testing, or even through the process, which will ease your life. It'll ease the process. So let's go through these one by one, and starting from perform game testing on the entire screen, not a part. So generally, very important part, when we're playing a game, we at times solely focus on the area that is interactive. So maybe, for example, temple rush. If I want my character to be running, and then if I swipe up, it's going to jump, I'll probably, when I'm testing, I'm just going to focus, okay, it's jumping well. But maybe when I jump, when I swipe up and the character jumps, something else on the screen breaks. So that's not going to be a very good experience. So make sure the entirety of the screen, the visibility, that's working fine. So that's one top tip. Then testing the game against specified rules. So this is, a QA person is by nature supposed to break the product or the project, because when your game is rolling out, okay, maybe you have a team of 20, maybe you have a team of 200. When the game is rolling out, it's going to hit masses, millions of people. You always estimate the biggest crowd that's going to hit on your game. So different players have different playing styles. So you gotta make sure that you're trying and testing everything that is with the rules and apart from the rules. So that's one thing. So that caters the negative testing. Third point basically is, do remember to carry the test for clipping two or more polygon objects. So when I say that, I mean to say, so if you're dealing with an open world game, especially, or maybe if your game has some room for movement here and there, make sure you're checking for all the objects that are not supposed to be collided. Okay, so try to overlap objects, try to move into places that are not supposed to move. So that's where you see maybe sprites are overlapping. You see, that's where you see maybe your characters blending into the environments. You don't want that to happen. So as you know, the further point says test for inappropriate collisions or closely mirror the character's behavior and moving through available objects. So that's where you should be looking at. So then test the loading of the game from another device. So maybe your game is supported on Android 8, 9, 10. Try it on Android 7. Try it on Android 6. Try it on if your game is supporting iOS, try it on different iOS level. So make sure what's the behavior on unsupported or different supported platforms. So basically, there is an area where your game is not supported, so it's definitely not going to be working. But even for the supported formats, maybe the behavior is different. So you have to make sure everything is tested in that part. Then verify the game shows appropriate messages to all the users at all points. So interactiveness cares to two parts. One, interactiveness is your animations are smooth, your gameplay is smooth. Second is the text that is coming in the game should be on an appropriate space, should be addressable, should be readable. You don't want a message to pop on the entire screen or pop onto certain corner that a user cannot read or access. So make sure throughout the entirety of the game your messages are being properly shown and their designated places. They're readable and they have proper screen time, and then they go away. So those kind of things. So, and lastly, testing of the game leads to memory overload in case the game is left on for several days. So this is closely related to soak testing. So you have to make sure the backend is working fine. Your game is not leading to excessive memory usage of the device, because nowadays people are using multiple applications at the same time. So even though the devices have lots of RAMs and lots of hard storage, but if your game is supposed to eat up like 100 MBs or 2 GBs of RAM, and it's taking up like 4 or 5, eventually increasing to more load, it's gonna kill the experience. So those are some of the tips and tricks you need to have on top of your head to make a good QA. So concluding the talk, we've gone through all these things, and I hope that you learn a lot from this, and it encompass a QA strategy around the entirety of gaming. Concluding it, since each game's development process is different, so every game is going to behave differently. There are going to be different components. There's going to be different requirements. So being a QA person, first of all, own the product, and by owning the product, understand game in and out, understand the requirements, lay down your plans regarding that, and don't just be a tester part, but be the owner and the end user part. So that's very important. That makes life a lot easier for you, and makes it easier for your plans to be conducted. And then conducting an effective game testing requires one to have a well-defined strategy. So the first part, when you have a good process laid out, then it's going to follow up to a good strategy that follow ups to good reporting. So at the end of the day, one liner that I would say, a game well tested is the game most immersive. So I'm not saying that a game won't have bugs at the end of the day. No application is bugless. So no matter if the games have been rolled out and they have like hundreds of patches over several years, it's still going to have bugs. But what I'm saying is, the most tested game, would have least bugs of least severity, won't be making crashes, would be helping game in their immersiveness. And the more immersive the game is, the more fan base. So that basically concludes my talk, and I hope that you learn a lot. And there's still a lot more room in game testing. This was the foundation. I tried to cover a lot of stuff, so I hope it was a good experience for you to go through this talk. And take care. Goodbye.